Y'all look fabulous this morning. I'm Ebony Manning, and I am the community coordinator in New Haven, Connecticut. Thank you for that. So, just a little quickly, I came to this work about 2.5 years ago after being in social services for I think it's been about 15 years, and I worked in therapeutic foster care, and we used to have this saying that about the kids, how they would always be here. They would be here long after we're gone. And so I was so excited to be a part of 0 to 3, where we are changing that. So the kids are leaving before we are. So that's what brought me to this work. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sarah Watamura, who, let me tell you, you're in for a treat. She is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Denver, where she directs the Child Health and Development Lab and co-directs the Stress, Early Experience, and Development Research Center. She has a long-standing interest in children's physiologic regulation, their development with caregiving context, and in understanding mechanisms and trajectories from early life experiences to later physical health, mental health, cognitive, educational, and social emotional outcomes. Her work focuses on the role of adverse, protective, and promotive factors in families experiencing poverty and among newly immigrated and refugee families, and includes testing, promising intervention, and approaches. I had the pleasure of hearing her speak at NTI, and what I took away is people are not going to stress me because I need to protect my organs. So if you heard her, you understand. So please, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Sarah Watamura.
Good morning. I actually am curious, how many people, do I look familiar? How many people have seen me before? Okay, not too many. So thank you. First, I want to start just by saying thank you so much for the difficult, important work that you are doing, taking the time to come these few days and get re-energized and refocused on really breaking these intergenerational cycles. I am a scientist. I'm going to talk about the science of adversity, why we think it is so impactful, why early experiences in general are so impactful, and then we can talk about some intervention and prevention approaches that are popular, that are being used, some of the great things about them, maybe some of the limitations of the way we're thinking about those approaches. I'm happy to take questions. This is not a very big group. You can interrupt me if you want to. If you have a question, if you have a comment, feel free to do that. And then it looks like there is, I don't know how long the Starbucks line is right now. So people are still kind of struggling in, and then there's a break after this. So if you have questions afterwards, feel free to just come up and ask, and we can chat about it. So I am part of a research center. As Ebony mentioned, I will be representing the work of several of my colleagues during this talk today. And just wanted to highlight for you that we focus on understanding early experiences and the effects of stress from a lifespan perspective. So sort of left to right, we focus on pregnant moms and thinking about their representations of their own childhood. Dr. Narayan on the far left there works with parents who have very significant adversity histories, some of whom are unable to come up with a single 5-minute positive memory from their childhood without an intrusion. So some kind of, I got a new bike and it was amazing. Oh, but my dad was high. So that would be an intrusion. And then all the way kind of across the lifespan, working with infants, new parents, adolescents, young adults, and then all the way on the right, my colleague, Dr. Dmitrieva, works with adjudicated young adults. So basically that full cycle of folks that you all work with, and we try to think about that intersection from a family level perspective. So what is happening with the child, with the parent, grandparents, other adults in their lives, and where the right points of investigation and intersection might be. So this is our plan for today. We're going to talk first to make sure we're all on the same page what the evidence is for the impacts of early life adversity on lifelong health. I think probably most of you have encountered this information. So we're going to go pretty quickly through that, but there's a couple of studies that I want to highlight for you just to make sure that we're all sharing the same message out across the country. And then the second is to talk about resilience, relationships, and the toxic stress framework. So why did the ACE study have a big splash in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then nobody heard about it again until 2010? I think the toxic stress framework provides some insight into that. We'll talk briefly about change points across the lifespan. So early life is definitely one of them, but there are multiple change points across the lifespan. And sometimes it's helpful to think about when those are happening so that you can think about when you might expect the folks that you're working with to be undergoing the most change from a biologic perspective, which is important because it's an opportunity when people are more open. It's also a vulnerability. So it's a time when experiences are particularly important. And then we'll talk about intervention and remediation. Okay, so starting with the familiar territory about early adversity and its lifelong consequences, we have been studying for 40 years or so, folks have been studying the effects of stress on health. We have really good data on this. Big, huge studies with thousands and thousands of people in Europe where they have medical records that they can track across the entire lifespan. Really a lot of data to connect severe and chronic stressful experiences with poor health outcomes. Stress affects susceptibility and progression of illness, so both whether you get sick and what happens after you get sick. That's definitely true for cardiovascular disease, so that would include heart disease and stroke, diabetes and infectious illness. It's also true for some kinds of cancer and probably lots of other diseases that have received less attention. Part of the way that happens, part of the way that you end up with these chronic disease conditions is that stressful experiences change the way your body functions. It changes your set points, it changes your responses, and just to highlight a few of those risk factors that stress impacts. Stress makes it more likely that you'll be obese, not just that you'll be obese, but it makes it more likely that you'll carry weight around the midline. That is because stressful experiences require a great deal of energy. They're metabolically costly to fight or flight or freeze. And so if you've been hit by stressful experience after stressful experience, you tell your body you're going to need energy unpredictably. You don't know when it's going to happen, whether you will have eaten recently. So a good idea might be to store some energy. And we store our energy in fat, right? So if we put it around the midline, we'd be able to get it kind of anytime we need it, like a little life raft. It's kind of convenient. So it's sensible from that perspective, but of course that's a major risk factor for heart disease, right? Having not only carrying the extra weight, but carrying it around the midline. That double-edged story where something provides you an adaptive short-term advantage but puts you at a long-term cost is the consistent story that you will hear for many of the body and brain changes that happen when people have been exposed to chronic and severe stressful experiences. So your brain and body are working hard to keep you safe, to protect you in the short run, to prepare for the future, but some of those things literally shave years off your life. It decreases immune function, it increases metabolic syndrome, so that's what gets measured when you go to get a physical. Who's had a physical this year? I've started asking everybody this. Okay, those of you who don't have your hand up, it's a yearly event. You should go in and get checked. I know it seems hard to do, but prevention is, we all believe in prevention, right? We all think prevention is where we should, okay. So metabolic syndrome would be things like your triglycerides, that kind of stuff. It's also the case that stressful experiences change the way you think about things, what you remember, what you pay attention to. Again, back to this idea of what your body does to keep you safe. People who have experienced lots of stressful experiences are quick to notice danger. They pick up on it, they attend to it, they react to it quickly. That's important, right, to keep safe in an unsafe environment. But if you're in a relatively quiet environment like a classroom, and you're spending a lot of your time worrying about the threats that might be present, both the social and the physical threats, what's happening in your home when you're not there, what's happening, what are those kids talking about across the room, why doesn't your teacher like you, all of those kinds of factors, because you have trained your brain to constantly look for threats. It's hard to pay attention to things that don't seem immediately relevant, right? So having a lot of attention and memory for threats you've experienced takes resources that you could be allocating to other long-term processes. It's perhaps not surprising that stressful experiences increase the risk of depression and anxiety. I'm happy to share the slides. I don't know if you guys have a system, so don't feel like you have to write everything down or take pictures. I mean, you're welcome to take pictures if you want, but I think they'll share them with you. Significantly increased risk for depression and anxiety, also for externalizing problems, so acting out behaviors. But depression and anxiety I find actually really interesting because if you are spending a lot of your energy remembering and attending to threatening things in your environment, it's actually not very surprising that you would then be at risk for anxiety disorders, because the difference between anxiety and fear is, anybody know? Credible threat. So if the thing is credible, we call that fear, right? If you're afraid of things that are not likely to happen, like, falling out of an elevator, we call that anxiety. So if you train your brain to watch constantly for threatening things in the environment, it's just a tiny walk from that to being anxious about things that are not as credible threats. And then probably the most dramatic thing that's received the most attention is the fact that chronic stressful experiences can accelerate aging quite dramatically. So the way that we think this works is you have on the top left there, that is a picture of a chromosome. The green, illustrated in green, are the telomeres, which are the end caps of the chromosomes. We believe that is non-coding DNA, so not parts that you need to make proteins. But what happens is every time a cell replicates, which is happening all the time in everybody's body, a little bit of that green part gets cut off. And that's fine because you don't need that part. But eventually, if you replicate your cells enough times, the green part is all gone, and then the pink starts to unravel, which is the coding DNA. So that's not compatible. That cell is no longer functional. If that starts happening to all your cells, you're getting near the end of your life. So we can measure the length of that end cap, that telomere length, to get a read on your functional age as distinct from your chronologic age. So you probably all know people who seem a lot older than they are, right? And you maybe also all know people who seem a lot younger than their age, right? We both encounter those types of folks. And if you think about it, just pull up in your mind, what are the characteristics of the folks who seem a lot older than they are, experiences and characteristics? And what about those people who seem a lot younger than they are? And that might give you some insight into where we're headed in terms of the prevention and intervention space. So this is the mechanistic explanation for a potential mechanistic explanation for the dramatic evidence we have on how much lifespan is impacted by stressful experiences. When you experience a lot of stress, you accelerate your maturation. That's an important thing to do if you're threatened, but this process can then really put you on this fast trajectory. It is not permanent, so when I learned this, when this first started to be something we learned in biology, we talked about it just like we used to talk about neurons. Does everybody remember when you talked about how your brain cells died and then that's it? Okay, that you're old enough to remember that, right? Like, oh, I fried my brain, bummer. Fortunately, nature has our back a little bit more than that, right? And we can regrow brain cells. It's not easy, but we can do it. You can also reverse this process. So you can increase your telomerase activity. You can regrow your telomeres. It is possible to do that. So it isn't like once they're chopped off, you're done. Can you think about what might regrow them? What kinds of behaviors might signal your body that you need to live longer? Exercise is probably the best studied. Anything else? Yeah, there's some work on meditation mindfulness. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there hasn't been, or I haven't seen yet, but I bet social connection is going to be another one of them that will come up. All right, so you probably know that smoking, obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes, pretty much everybody knows that those are risk factors, right? They shave years off your life. They shave between 5 and 10 years off your total lifespan. Childhood stress is thought to shave up to 20 years off your total lifespan. So as a risk factor, there really isn't anything close. Those things are not disconnected. So we've already talked about how if you've experienced a lot of chronic and severe stress, you're more likely to carry extra weight, right? So they're not necessarily disconnected. But if you're looking for something in childhood to identify families and individuals and communities that need additional supports, this really is a key factor, and something that this fact has really galvanized a lot of communities, various different sectors, lots of people trying to work on this problem. That number, that 20-year lifespan reduction number, comes from the ACE study, which I'm sure you've heard of, but if you haven't, you can just Google it. You can go to the CDC website. It was a large-scale collaborative project between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention with over 17,000 people. It began in 1995 in Southern California. They were all people who had health insurance. In 1995, a relatively what we call demographically low-risk sample, very different from the families you probably work with, very different from the families I work with. But in that sample, what they basically did was ask people retrospectively about things that may have happened in their childhood, abuse, neglect, incarcerated parent, substance abusing parent, mentally ill household member, that kind of thing. Actually, substance use, incarceration is anyone in the household. And then track their medical records across time. And basically, the more ACEs, that's how they refer to it, the more ACEs somebody had, the more poor health outcomes they encountered. And if they had 6 or more ACEs on a total possible scale of 10, those are the folks who had the 20-year lifespan reduction. A couple of other things that came out of this work is how common adverse childhood experiences are. So only 1/3 of the general population reports 0 adverse childhood experiences. And those numbers have been replicated in lots and lots of communities. So the federal government administers the BRFIS. You might be familiar with that, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System survey, every year in every state and territory. So you should be able to access that data from your state. Some states it's kind of hard, but you should be able to. They added an optional ACE module, and something like 25 states and territories now have used it. So they can connect people's risk factors and health outcomes from that survey to their adverse childhood experiences. Because, of course, a natural question was, there's something weird about this sample in Southern California, or have things changed since 1995? And the numbers have been really pretty stable. So about 2/3 of people have experienced at least one ACE, but then getting to experiencing 4 or more, which is the threshold for chronic conditions, that's something like 12 to 15% of the general population. Then if you do anything to make the population less general, so you go to Head Start, or you go to, if you went to a child welfare involved population, those numbers are going to skyrocket, right? So you're going to start to see, 40, 50, 60, 80% of the folks coming in with very high ACE scores. It's not a perfect study. There's lots of things that they didn't ask about. People have made alternate versions of it. So, for example, trafficking is not asked. So if you live in a community where trafficking is an issue, obviously that should have been on the ACE score. And then it doesn't account for protective factors. So lots of folks have developed complementary measures about protective factors that may have also been happening in childhood. But anyway, it has given some really critical information. And just to illustrate, this is available from the CDC. You can download these. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask if you
So, sure, that's a great question. So people have included, and we do also include measures of discrimination, racism. Sometimes you see people have included things just about experiencing poverty. I've seen versions where people include peer victimization, that kind of school-based factors. In all cases, these are cumulative indicators. So it's more about how many things and less about which ones. So in general, there's not comparison of is it worse to have this or that. But I will tell you that there is a long-standing body of research on the damaging health effects of racism, where you see, it'll be interesting to see because the climate is so different now. But a lot of the effects are due to what we call microaggressions. So before recent history, if someone behaves in an overtly racist manner, most health consequences don't accrue because the individual is able to say sort of, you notice it, you're like, that person is racist, put it in this bucket. The microaggressions, the everyday, holding your purse, slamming the door in my face, assuming I don't know things, all of those kinds of factors, those take a daily toll on health that are really pretty dramatic. So I'm not sure now because the situation is where overt racist threats are very physically threatening, I think is going to change that dynamic a little bit. But racism has huge effects on health, and that has been documented in other kinds of work. Okay, so the CDC's website, you can download these slides. I encourage you to do that. They're free. You can use them anywhere. We share this information with parents. But basically, this adverse experiences, if your life expectancy at birth was 80, we're now talking about 60. And that has a huge cost to all of us, not just the individual whose life is cut short, but to all of us because of the lost productivity, the lost contributions that person would have made to their community at that point in their life where they're typically earning their highest earning potential, spending time with their grandchildren, volunteering in their communities. We are all suffering from that lost lifespan. And typically, if someone is dying at 60, they've also been unhealthy for quite some time before that. So we're talking about maybe from 50 or 45 that somebody wasn't able to participate in the community at the ultimate, at their maximum potential. And so it's a huge, huge loss to all of us. And it's a loss of potential that begins in childhood. So that is just an unacceptable set of circumstances, right? That we are limiting the total capabilities of our societies in childhood by our failure to prevent child maltreatment and related issues. So just to illustrate the maturational timeline, I have mentioned that it is adaptive for the individual in the short run to accelerate their aging, right, to accelerate their maturation. And that begins actually in utero. So if a fetus is experiencing a stressful in utero environment, low nutrients, other kinds of issues, that baby is more likely to be born early, to come out early, right? And some of the process, when the fetus initiates that preterm birth, they start in accelerating maturation in utero. So maturing the lungs, prioritizing some types of maturation over others. If an individual experiences lots of stressful experiences in childhood, they're more likely to hit puberty early. Then they're more likely to childbear early. And you can see this sort of red line, this accelerated maturational timeline. And I just want to point out that it's very important as a species that we retain the ability to do that. If there's a famine, people have to get down to business. We can't all have kids at 40, right? Like, it's good to be able to do this when necessary. However, of course, what we're hoping for when we look at a newborn is that they were born at term and healthy, that they have a long, happy childhood where they figure out who they are and what they want to be, that they hit puberty as late as possible, that they childbear after they have stable jobs and relationships, that they have a long, productive career and engagement in their community across their whole adulthood, and that they die around 100, like in their sleep, and don't cost a lot of money on the back end. So that's what we're hoping for, right? And so what is lost, if you just imagine the differences in those two trajectories, how many points are we all losing out on what that child could have been, what that child could have contributed? Okay, just a couple of little facts that people find helpful when they're talking to folks in their own communities. Babies start responding to the internal environment, to the stress indicators in utero. So this is a study with pregnant moms where they tracked their stress levels, both their stress hormones and their perceptions. And then right at birth, what they did is they ran over to the hospital. The babies got a heel stick blood draw, which all babies get. It's a medically necessary procedure, but it is stressful for the baby. It takes a few minutes. It hurts. I don't know if anyone's been there when it happens. And so what they did is they looked at how the babies responded to that heel stick blood draw, and they compared the babies whose moms had had high stress hormone levels during early pregnancy and those who had had lower levels. And basically what you can see is both the yellow and the green line, all the babies got really mad when they got poked. Nobody liked it. But then by not even 2 minutes, the babies whose moms had low stress hormones early in pregnancy went right back down to baseline. So they're over it, they're calm, they're ready for the next thing. Whereas the babies whose moms had had high stress hormones early in pregnancy stayed vigilant during the entire window that they were observed. So within 24 hours of birth, babies who had had this higher stress exposure in utero were paying more attention when they were threatened. Okay, so whatever the root cause of that, whether it's genetic, it's the exposure in utero, they are different within 24 hours of birth. They are more responsive to threats directed at their bodies, right? They stay vigilant to those threats right away. They tracked these same kids across time. The same kids were also more likely to be depressed and anxious at 6 to 8 years of age. And they had larger right amygdala volumes, which is the part of the brain. It does lots of things, but one of the things it does is monitor the environment for threat. So those are basically all the same story. It's telling you that these kids, right away at birth, within 24 hours of birth, monitor the environment for threat. They have prioritized that. And they have a brain and behavior that is consistent with that story, okay? This is a different project. In this project, they wanted to look at infant brains. It's actually kind of tricky to look at infant brains. So who's had an MRI? Anybody had an MRI? What's it like in there? Claustrophobic, loud. And what do they tell you to do? Right, relax, stay still, right? So they'll just put the babies in there and tell them not to move, right? So of course that doesn't work. So what they do is they put them to sleep first, and then they put, which is actually, the parents can't believe it, but it actually works. So you put the babies to sleep, put them in the magnet. So now you need to think about something that they can do in there while they're sleeping that's worth having them do, right? So what they decided to do in this project is have the babies listen, because you can hear while you're sleeping, listen to angry or neutral adult voices, and they asked the parents how much fighting was going on at home. What you can see in this picture is that the babies whose parents reported more fighting at home had brains who were more responsive to angry versus neutral adult voices while they were asleep. So this study had a really big impact on me because sleeping babies have lots of things to do other than track the environment for angry adults, right? It's amazing that they're able to do that they can allocate resources to doing that. But it's also very concerning. And it continues to be the case that children who are exposed to domestic violence and maltreatment are very, very quick to notice the microseconds when adults change from neutral to negative, their faces or their voices. They can do that because that's a really good signal of bad things to come. They can get themselves, hidden or in another room or something like that. But that takes a lot of effort, right, to keep that level of vigilance all the time. What are you not doing because you're doing that? And then if you compare them to kids who have not had those experiences, they take, they do eventually notice, but it takes them a few seconds to figure out that oh, what's wrong? Somebody's mad, because they have not prioritized that. So just a couple of studies that I find useful when talking to families about how early this happens, and that it's happening even when you don't think your kids are noticing, right? That they're very sensitive to their environment, even when they're asleep. So the general ACE story, this is the story, the way that ACEs are usually told. If you have, in this case, 5 or more ACEs, you're at a very high increased risk of having depression. So the baseline rate in our community is 2 in 10 in the country. And in folks with 5 or more ACEs, it's 6 in 10. So a dramatic increase in the chance of having depression. This is an important story. This is something that we want to make sure that everyone knows. But when you are working with families, as I think many of you are, for whom this has already happened to the adults, right? This has already happened. And you want to motivate them to do something different for their kids and all of that, they need some time to process the fact that you're talking about their lifespan, right? I'm telling you, I'm all about your kid, and I'm telling you should do this and that differently so that your kid doesn't die early. And you're hearing, I'm going to die. You're hearing, I'm already on this horrible trajectory, and I'm going to get all these bad illnesses. And that has to be processed, right? And we have done a very bad job of thinking about how adults are processing this information. So one thing that can be really helpful is to focus attention not to accept or say that it's okay that these things happened in childhood, because it is absolutely not. But what about those 4 people? Okay, what can we do in adulthood and in childhood for the folks who have already had this happen to them? I already told you that you can regrow your telomeres, right? We need to not stop the story when we're talking with parents at this horrible, in the effort to motivate them to do better with their kids, we stop too early. And I don't think people can hear you when what they hear is that their life is essentially over, right? So I think that's a really important piece, and we've been trying to focus more attention on understanding what can you do yourself now at this point in your adulthood when you're trying to change things, turn things around for yourself and your kids. And what kinds of protective factors can you do when your 2, 4, 6, 15-year-old has already experienced a lot of these problems? Because by the time you're interacting with most of these families, right, that's already occurred, okay? So we have to be careful, I think, about how we talk about this. That's really true in your population, but I actually think it's true no matter where you're having this conversation, because otherwise people get into this us-them stuff, right? Like those are the people who all those bad things happen to and they're gonna die early. That is just really unhelpful conversation, and not accurate, not accurate. It's a risk factor. There's all kinds of risk factors in the world and lots of ways to think differently about them. So some people shy away from sharing this kind of information from families. I actually don't think that's the way to go. What we do with our families is say, all right, so this is what the research says about your trajectory. What do you want to do about it? Here are the things that are changeable. Here are the things that already happened. And have that actual conversation versus what's happening a lot in a lot of places is screening for trauma, right? Where somebody asks you a bunch of questions, tallies it up on their little list, and goes, "Ooh, that's a high A score," and that's the end of the conversation, right? I don't think that's helpful. So we need to work on those next steps. Okay. So resilience. We love the idea of resilience in this country. We have these perceptions of folks who get out of unbelievably horrible circumstances. There are so many books and movies written about this idea. And I think resilience is a really, really fascinating, interesting topic. But from a scientific perspective, it is not only bad things and no good things. It actually is an equation of how did you balance those adversities? So if you think about, pull up your favorite in your mind, your favorite resilience movie. I don't know, you represent quite a few decades here, so you probably have different, looking around, you have different movies that would come to mind, right? But your favorite movie about resilience, what was the turnaround factor for the kids in that movie or in that book? relationships, right? So it could be, and there's a lot of research on this and a lot of personal experience on this. When you get in there and somebody has turned their life around, it's because somebody invested in them, a teacher, a coach, a neighbor, a parent, a grandparent. Somebody cared about them. Somebody gave them a vision of their future that was different than the one they were in, and believed in their ability to get to that future. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. When you're pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, you're doing that with somebody, right? There's a person involved in that. And so the rose in the desert thing isn't quite reality. It really is a balance. And some of the resources that go on the one side are things like intelligence, athletic ability, easy temperament, good social skills, stuff like that. For sure, there's personal characteristics that go in the resource bucket, but that's not all that goes in the resource bucket, and it's probably not the most important thing. The most important thing is somebody who cared about you. So in the toxic stress framework then, these three gentlemen organized a whole bunch of research into a framework that they hoped would help people focus on the key aspects of the conversation about stress and health. They organized stressful experiences into three types. Positive stress is a very important piece of the puzzle. So these are normative experiences that we all have that result in moderate, short-lived increases in our stress systems. You have to be challenged. It's important to be challenged. You have to try out for the school play, do a sport, have difficult conversations, fall in love, get your heart broken. That stuff has to happen to you. It's important for your health. It's important for your growth. So nobody is advocating that kids have no challenges. But then we get concerned when we're talking about very significant events that might be happening in a family. And the difference in this framework, they focus in on the difference between tolerable and toxic stress as the presence or absence of protective relationships. So tolerable stress is when you have the type of physiologic reactivity that could result in brain and body reorganization, but it doesn't because you have these supportive adult relationships. And toxic stress is when you have strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of your stress systems because you don't have these protective relationships. So if you think back to those babies who were getting the heel stick blood draw, some of them taking it on themselves, using their own brain and body to get through the situation versus relying on adults to help them. One of my favorite really old studies is an immunization study. So the babies went to get their immunizations with their parents. They all screamed. You could not tell the difference by looking at the babies. But the babies who got the immunization, went to the immunization visit with a parent to whom they were securely attached, did not have a stress physiology reaction, even though they were screaming their heads off, versus the kids who went to that appointment with somebody to whom they were not securely attached. So when do you have to rely on your own body versus trust the adults in your environment? So you can use this framework to try to identify leverage points. How chronic and high impact is the stressor? How uncontrollable and unpredictable is it? And how much support and responsivity is available? And what are the things you can change? So can you take some of the stress away? Can you make it more controllable or more predictable? So sometimes that's a real leverage point with families to try to give them more control over the situation they're in, or feel that they have more control. And then, of course, what kind of support can we provide to parents so that they can be this critical supportive person for their children? So it's important to remember that context is what we're talking about when we talk about toxic stress. What makes the difference between a toxic and a tolerable stressor is not the event, right? It's the context. So that's a really important piece that sometimes gets missed. And then another thing to keep in mind is that stress is what we do. We're good at it. We use our brains and bodies, and that's okay. But we want to use them to our advantage and not overuse and misuse these responses. So thinking about when is it adaptive and helpful and necessary to engage your body in your priorities, and when is it maladaptive, costly, and leading to physical and mental illness. Some of that has to do with the way you approach the situation, the way you think about the situation, and we've already talked about how much going into a challenge depends on, your response to it depends on who you're there with. So if you think about what happens in a natural disaster, for example, you often hear stories of communities coming together, people helping each other that never helped each other before, really sort of pulling together, building those social connections, this very engaged problem-solving mindset. Why do we not have the same reaction, right, when we're talking about something that is social or a different kind of we run, right? We run away from the threat in those kinds of situations when there's a family with substance use and domestic violence and a lot of those kinds of things. The community tends to pull away and disengage as compared to something like a flood. And you see different health outcomes when people pull together and view it as something they're going to get through, even though it's horrible, versus something that is overwhelming and unfixable and uncontrollable. Okay, so early experiences in general are very important. We have these big, amazing, underdeveloped brains at birth, and that makes it possible for us to do all kinds of things, be any career, go to the moon, have any kind of outcome. But it also means these big plastic underdeveloped brains means that we're very vulnerable at birth. So these are a bunch of newborn mammals who walk over to their mothers and start nursing right after they're born. And that's us, so not so much on the walking over and initiating nursing, right? We take a long time to walk independently. We are slow to develop. We are very fragile and vulnerable at birth. You guys have the best phone, the best rings. Okay. Is that a chicken? Okay. It's important. You don't want to miss that. I mean, okay. And then this early plasticity also means that babies start learning about their world in the womb. So this is another one of my favorite really old studies. What they did in this study is they had moms read a passage of The Cat in the Hat every day for from 7.5 months of pregnancy until the baby was born. And then right away at birth, they tested the babies for their memory of that passage that they heard. So the babies are born, they listen to the page, their mom reading the page of Cat in the Hat that they heard in the womb and a different page of Cat in the Hat. So if anybody not familiar with the Cat in the Hat? Okay, so it's very repetitive, right? So from one page to the next, very repetitive. So, and mom is reading both passages. Babies had to, let's take half of the babies for start, they had to suck on a pacifier really hard in order to hear their mom read the passage they heard in the womb. So they did that. The other half of the babies had to stop sucking on the pacifier to hear the passage they heard in the womb. So they did that. So they did whatever they had to do right after birth, this is again within 24 hours of birth, to hear the passage they heard in the womb. So that tells us that they remembered not just the cadence, not just their mom reading, they remembered the words, right? Because that's the only thing that differs between the two passages that were read right after birth. So just really fascinating that they're taking in these kinds of specific experiences really, really early, not just the negative ones, but also the positive ones. And they have capabilities that we don't have. So they can hear the sounds of every language in every possible place in the world. Of course they can, right? Because they could be adopted anywhere or born anywhere. Of course they can hear every language. But that's a remarkable skill. And being able to hear the sounds in every human language, that's a lot of sounds. And so that drops off in the first year of life. You stop being able to hear the sounds of languages you weren't exposed to. But they are able to do some things at birth that we cannot do. So this early openness to environment is a very important, interesting time. They're in a sensitive period, which means they're open to new experiences, they're vulnerable to new experiences, and they're expecting certain kinds of inputs at that time. So they're expecting language, clearly, based on these two slides. It starts super, super early. Your brain cells start talking to each other 7 weeks gestation, which is 5 weeks post-conception. Over 100,000 nerve cells are born per minute in the prenatal period, and there's 100 billion nerve cells at birth. So lots and lots happening. And then you can see that synapses, which are the connections between the neurons, are also at their peak in the first year of life. So everything's connected to everything else. which is actually not great for you. It's a little bit over-connected. But then that kind of focuses in on the things that are most important after that first year of life. So if I had an app right now that could connect all of our contacts on all of our smartphones, let's say I had one, there probably exists something like that, right? I could like press a button and everybody would have everybody else's contacts, and we think that was really great for about 2 minutes. And then you would go outside to call like your sister or something, and there'd be, 75 Kathys. And so that's what happens to the baby. Everything gets connected to everything else, and then they have to focus in on the things that are relevant for them. So how do you do that on your phone? How do you make sure you're calling the right people? Right, you make your contacts, you make your favorites, you might use your recents, right? That's exactly what the baby's doing, okay? What are the favorites? What are the things I need to get to most often? What are the recents? What are the things that just happened? It's not that they can't get to other things, they can, but it's slower. So they're making those favorites and those recents, and they're getting those very strong, fast connections so they can make those quick phone calls, okay? That's basically what's happening. We have learned in the recent times how much is happening in adolescence, how much brain development is continuing in adolescence. In the limbic and cortical regions, the hippocampus, amygdala, lots and lots of brain development continuing into adolescence. And the main way you hear about this is what? Oh my God, their brains are still developing. Don't let them drive cars. Oh, they're just texting all the time, and the drugs, and it's terrible. Their brains are still developed. That's how we tell the story. Why in early childhood is it this amazing sensitive period, and in adolescence it's all bad? I mean, it's really unfair. It is true that they're still working out decision-making and risk-taking and emotion regulation, key important skills that many adults do not have, right? Yes, that's what they're working on. Very, very important time. We know that when kids experience adversity in early childhood and in adolescence, their health outcomes are much worse than when they experience adversity at only one of those 2 time points. So does that mean you should give up on the adolescence, or does that mean you should try harder for the adolescents who have had a tough early childhood? Of course it means you should try harder, right? But we somehow have missed this message, and people like run from packs of adolescents, right? Nobody wants to talk to them. So we really need to think about this as a positive, sensitive period where they need safe opportunities to practice making difficult decisions, to take safe risks, to regulate their emotions so that they don't turn into adults who have a hard time with these skills, which is a lot of people. Okay, and then parenting changes your brain. So the folks you're working with who have babies and are in the court system are also likely undergoing some potentially massive changes to their brain. These neural changes that happen in supportive parenting change the way you handle stress. They promote positive emotions and bonding. They increase your motivation to take care of that baby, and they promote specific caregiving behaviors. This is a new area of research, a really interesting, lot of stuff coming out. Changes the reward circuit, which is the part of the brain that helps you decide which things you should approach, like food or sex, but can also be co-opted by things like substances of abuse. It changed, yeah. Both mothers and new fathers. It's primarily all done with biologic parents. I think we will see similar results with folks who are caregiving who are not biologically related, but that hasn't been done yet. But mothers and fathers experience massive restructuring of their brain to do this very difficult job of parenting. And it's really helpful and important that this happens. So why do you get up all the times in the middle of the night to take care of this tiny creature? Because your reward system has made this your top priority. So the reason there's a rat on there, I'm mindful of time here. I think we started a little late, but the reason there's a rat on here is you may not know this about rats, but all rats like cocaine. That's not true for all humans. If you put a rat in a cage and they can press the lever to get cocaine or press the lever for food or water, they will press the lever for cocaine and not eat or drink. Take a new mom rat and put her in the box, and she presses the button for cocaine or presses the button to hear her pup cry. She presses it to hear her pup cry. So complete reorganization of that system. We think of cries as an aversive stimulus. They are a highly motivating stimulus. Okay, so you may not like the sound of it, but it sure gets your butt across the room, right? And why is it so horrible to be on an airplane with a crying infant? Because you can't fix it, right? It's not your job to fix it. So it is a very powerful stimulus. The social information circuit is the part of your brain that helps you detect social signals. Babies give very tiny and unreliable social signals. You have to figure out what they need, what they want. So you get a boost in this brain area to do that. And then if parenting is nothing if not a giant emotion regulation task, right? It's very tough. You have to care and be motivated about your baby's distress, but not so overwhelmed that you just cry, right? So you have to hit that balance between those two things. So we see lots of changes in the emotion regulation circuits that make that job possible. When all of those things happen, it becomes much easier to do this very, very, very difficult job of parenting in a world with lots of other factors to consider. And actually, it really matters for the quality of the parenting that people provide. However, when people come to the table of parenting with lots of adversity, their own trauma experience, poor parenting history, substance use, they don't get the same boost in their brain, okay? So when parents are saying things to you like, I don't love this baby as much as I think I should, when she cries, I just cry, they're telling you they're not getting this boost that they need. One of the things I think really has to happen and that we're working on is how to help people in that sort of 6 to 8 weeks before babies really start being rewarding. Because even by 6 to 8 weeks, you can be on the trajectory toward harsh parenting, right? Because the baby's woken them up a bunch of times in the night, doesn't smile, cries. There's a lot of things that are hard about that period. And if your brain is not helping you through that, it's extra, extra hard. And it's already really hard. So I think this is really important literature. We're trying to figure out how to do it. We're doing a new study now. We're doing some neuroimaging with some teen moms who are doing pretty well, parenting pretty well. We're calling it the Resilient Brain Project because the same areas of the brain that are impacted by stress are still developing in adolescence and are needed for parenting. So what happens when all of those factors are working together? But lots to be learned here. This is a new area of research, but just keep in mind, even your parents are in a sensitive period where inputs and outputs really matter. So brains change, consider the timing, the relationships, and the context of the adversity, of the inequity, of the opportunity, of the intervention or the prevention. That bottom there, if you Google 2 open windows, Aspen Institute 2 open windows, we wrote a white paper organizing all that information about the parental neurobiology. You can just download it. It's intended for anyone to use, so feel free to do that. 2 open windows, Aspen Institute. Okay, last step, intervention. First, of course, is prevention. I think it's really interesting that the CDC has this technical package available for how to prevent child abuse and neglect, and most of it is prevention. It starts with economic supports for families as the first thing you might do to prevent child abuse and neglect, which I think is really, really telling. Changing social norms that support families and provide positive parenting. Like, what do we do when we meet a new parent, a new family, right? We go right away. If we talk to them at all, we say things like, oh, are you over the moon? Look at the beautiful baby, which is lovely. But what about the parent, right? Are you exhausted? Do you have enough support? What's happening in your life? This is a really tough time. And then how much does the community support a culture of positive parenting? How many parents, especially young parents, are being told by their older relatives that they should punish, right? That they should spank, they're being told that by their community. 70% of Americans still endorse spanking as an appropriate discipline technique, even though the research completely does not support that, right? So, but you're trying to parent, you're exhausted, and the people who have done this job in your life, your parents, your older siblings, are telling you that you should do things that maybe don't feel right to you, but you don't have other sources of information. So a culture of positive parenting. It's hard to believe that positive parenting is what works, but it is what works. Enhancing parenting skills, lessen harm, prevent future risks. So you can download this, it's available from the CDC, but first, prevention. So I was asked to talk about evidence-based intervention approaches, but I think prevention is really the place to start. It's really important to keep in mind that not only, so the bottom graph you may have seen before, that's rising in income inequality in this country, dramatic rises in income inequality, differences between the top earners and the bottom earners. But the bigger graph is showing you that not only is our income disparities increasing, the cost of those to health is increasing. So the differences in health between the more economically advantaged and less economically advantaged folks are getting bigger. Does that make sense? So the difference is bigger and the cost of the difference is bigger. That's an alarming combination of trends. I think it can be helpful to think about in your community, to your own mind, what is the root of the problem? What is the place that you would start? I think there's a lot of different important places to start. Education, workforce development, mental health, drug treatment, various kinds of places you could start. What is the place in your community that feels like the right place to start for you? And that differs. And then what do families identify as the root cause? Why are they where they are? Asking those questions, I think, can be really helpful in order to think about what kind of intervention makes the most sense, rather than assuming that every family, the same intervention would work the same way for every family. Making change is hard. It takes a lot of tiny steps. There's a lot of really difficult things to untangle. Preparing parents for parenting, so that could be first-time parents, it could be foster parents, it could be re-entry families. I think the very first step is to address their own trauma, to address their own poor caregiving histories. How do we expect them to do this job if they have no model of how to do it well, and have had no time to process not getting what they needed? Supporting mental health, positive mental health, parenting, when you're suffering from depression and anxiety is, I don't know, in demographically low-risk communities, not the ones that you guys are generally serving, that's the top issue, right? It's super, super hard to parent when you're suffering from those mental health concerns. Supporting positive behavioral health. So this isn't just not using substances, it's also doing things that support your good health, sleeping well, exercising, the things that we've been talking about. We actually tend to avoid talking about those things with families who have a lot of stuff going on, which is really ridiculous and unfair, right? If exercise is the thing that regrows your telomeres and gets your lifespan back on track, why am I not talking to you about that just because you also have these other concerns? Supporting economic, workforce, and educational opportunities so that you can imagine a future life that's different than the one you're in. Encouraging a growth mindset, you can start that really early. We're the type of family who solves problems together. We're the type of family who gets through it even when times are tough. Talking to your kids about problems in that way, encouraging parents to talk about their difficult circumstances in that way. Saying to families that turn up in front of us, wow, you are really tough. Look at everything you've been through already. I know you can do this because look at what you've already been through already. Yeah, okay, this situation is really terrible. What are we gonna do about it? What would you like to do about it? And related, developing parental efficacy and agency. So not taking away efficacy and agency, because nobody changes anything in their life ever if they don't believe they can, right? How do you lose weight? How do you quit smoking? How do you save money? How do you do any of the things that everybody in this room has tried to do? Because you believe you can, right? Because you think you have some level of control over those factors. We tend to take away efficacy and agency in our efforts to help people. Like, we know what's best. You do what I say. And then, pretty low down the list for me is teaching parenting skills. I actually think parenting skills are important, but a lot of times people know what to do if they can clear away a lot of this other cobwebby stuff. And even if they really, truly don't, I want them to believe that they do, right? If I walk out of a home visit and they think I would make a lovely parent for their child, I have done them a grave disservice, right? They are the only person on this earth who's going to parent that child. They are the person meant to do that job. So I always talk about exercise with folks, lots of different ways to do it. It has so many benefits. We tend to talk about meditation or mindfulness as this, who meditates? Do we have any meditators in the room? Okay, great for you. That's awesome. I'm really impressed. Most people cannot pull that off. That does not mean you can't do any mindfulness, right? If you're the kind of person who pulls into your driveway and has no idea how you got home, or you you know, go out to a lovely dinner or make a lovely dinner and all of a sudden your plate's empty? Did I eat that food? Did that actually happen? Especially at lunch? Do that at lunch? Did I eat lunch? I think I did. Okay, that's the opposite of mindfulness. We can all make, just like you can take the stairs, park further away, you can make tiny increases to your exercise, right? You can do the same thing for mindfulness. Just eat your lunch. Just drive your car. It's 2 tons of metal. Put the phone in the back seat. Just drive the car. That's all you're doing. Just have a conversation with somebody. So we can all make those small changes daily and not try to rat race ourselves through our entire day. And those cumulative changes can make a big difference. And then you might be prepared to do some body awareness, body scanning, some meditation, get to the point that you can do that. You might have to start with simpler things. Connect, engage, invest. The more you give, the more you get. The research supports that. Even when you force people to give, it has positive effects on them. So building communities is a really key strategy. These are just highlighting a bunch of different cognitive approaches that can be really helpful. Reframing, reappraising, mental distancing, radical acceptance therapy. Again, I don't really care which one people choose. I'm all for parents choosing their own approach, what feels right to them, what would build their toolbox. I just finished pilot testing a curriculum that I wrote that's for parents who have significant ACE history, where we just work through these. Let's try all these out and you pick the tools that work for you. And then predictable, reliable, positive parenting, of course, is the goal we're aiming for with all of our families. But in order to accomplish that, they need respite, they need backup, right? And they need forgiveness, because they've probably already really messed it up, okay? The more they learn about what they should do, the worse they feel about what they didn't do for this kid or their 14-year-old. So some time for that also has to happen. And then these are some effective parenting interventions. Some you've probably heard of, maybe others you haven't. In the middle, the ABC and the MTFCP are the only ones, to my knowledge, that have outcomes on measures we think matter for stress. However, a bunch of the ones at the bottom are all being tested now in a collaborative big research project to try to look at what types of interventions actually change stress physiology and then ultimately, we hope, health. So you're welcome to check out any of those. But again, I advocate for a strategy that lets parents have some choice in what kind of approach they use, rather than assuming there's one size fits all. And those are acknowledgements. So I don't know, questions, or should I get, what do you want to do? Okay. Questions? Hi. Thanks. Sure.
You actually brought up something, and I agree with you about all the layers and everything.
Mm-hmm.
You actually focused on something that I've never heard anybody really talk about, that really is something that I struggle with. So I run a center where we do a great deal of child care and psychotherapy for high-risk populations. And some of them in the child welfare system, some of them in the criminal justice system.
Sure.
When you were talking earlier about the brain and just seeing this sort of, for those parents that whatever those changes are, those hormone changes,
Right.
do not kick on.
Right.
One of the things that we see and struggle with a lot of, even if we had that perfect community where there's
Sure.
supports and education at every level, we find in a very micro way that if we're working with a parent and they get a tremendous amount of trauma,
Sure. Sure.
we say first everybody needs a trauma assessment.
Sure. Sure.
If they do not get activated by
Right.
their child's
Right.
problems, they don't get activated by all the things that are going to make those positive circulatory responses.
Right.
The rest of that doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's really important for people working with these families to understand.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a parent who doesn't get activated when their baby cries,
Right.
hear those cries, they cannot see danger, or they can't keep themselves safe, so they can't
Right.
figure out that they're not supposed to be letting their child climb on the top of a shelf because it could fall on them. We can tell them to do all the mindfulness things in the world. First, they're probably not going to do all of them.
Right.
And secondly, it is really that change in the brain that you're talking about
Yeah, no, I really agree with that. And I think we don't know that much about how to get it jump-started when it's not starting on its own. Does that look like more, I don't think it's just sort of more FaceTime with baby, for example. It's... Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So her comment is that in their work, what they notice is that if parents don't respond, their brain and their behavior doesn't respond to their baby, that caregiving system is not activated early on. Nothing else really works. So that she feels like that's sort of the core issue, is how to get that caregiving system activated. If they've been through so much trauma that they themselves don't recognize danger, they're not activated by those caregiving signals, that's really the core issue in her experience. And I was saying, I think that we also just don't know how to start that system when it's not starting on its own. I've talked to lots of parents who have had sort of 2 kids, one where they didn't get that, and one where they did, and the contrast for them is so dramatic. I think, teen parents, I think it's hard for those systems to get activated in very young parents. Not all of them, but sometimes. So how do we jumpstart that? What kind of behavioral support? She's talking about parent-child psychotherapy. I would be supportive of a pharmacologic support if that works, right? Like, can I give you a nasal spray of oxytocin while you're interacting with your baby? I mean, that exists. They do it in Europe. Can I get you over that hump so that the child becomes this organizing, activating stimulus that all the other parents are getting, so that you can do this? You're trying to do this job under these horrible circumstances, and you're not getting the same support from your brain and body because of what has already happened to you. So is there something that we can do to get that back on track? Okay. I'll come down.